So I guess a good place to start, considering your background, is with endurance, training and stuff like that. So um, somebody comes to you and asks you why, endurance training should matter. I know you probably are familiar with, some people who really like lifting weights, or maybe some people who don't like to exercise at all, and they come to you and are asking you what's important or beneficial about, running or cycling or whatever it may be, like endurance training regularly. What's your response?
Yeah, so, the obvious preface to this would be strength and endurance training are both important and everybody should do both. Often, unfortunately, in discussions on like social media, people like make it black or white. It's like, oh, I'm just gonna lift or I'm just gonna do cardio. And obviously, like you mentioned, each of us kind of have a preference. So I am an endurance athlete and I've always been a runner, so I like to run and I like to do cardio as my main form of exercise, while obviously recognizing that I need to strength train to just maintain muscle mass and prevent injury. But in terms of, I think, the benefits of endurance training, sometimes people refer to it as cardio. I don't really like the term cardio. I like aerobic exercise or kind of endurance training because, like, cardio is essentially like, oh, it works the cardiovascular system. Well, strength training kind of does that too, in a way. So, the benefits of endurance training, mainly they're going to be related to cardiovascular health. So, the benefits for your heart, just keeping your heart strong, keeping your left ventricle in particular strong and healthy. Endothelial function, one thing that I did some research on during grad school is something called endothelial function. And that basically just refers to the ability of your blood vessels to dilate. So you want elastic blood vessels that are able to dilate, widen to increase blood flow. That's essential for blood pressure regulation, keeping a healthy blood pressure, one that's not too high, but also one that's not too low. Reducing arterial stiffness. So as we age and or are more sedentary, the stiffness of our arteries can increase. That's not a good thing. Endurance training, aerobic training, however you want to refer to it, it counteracts all of those things. There have been some pretty neat, interesting studies that have shown exercise can reverse cardiovascular aging, and it can prevent cardiovascular aging from happening. So if you take like long-term endurance athletes, if you look at their hearts, you look at their blood vessels, they resemble those of, people 20, 30 years younger. So it's pretty remarkable. And most of those are just like with 8 weeks of endurance training, you can kind of see reversals in some of these aging markers of, endothelial function, arterial stiffness and whatnot. So it has profound effects just on preventing almost cardiovascular aging, which is obviously super important. I think something that's also important that endurance training does is help to increase or maintain your VO2 max. So most people will kind of know what VO2 max is. It's gained popularity kind of lately, but VO2 max is essentially the maximum amount of oxygen. It's actually a rate of oxygen consumption, but the maximum amount of oxygen that your body can use during maximal exercise. So if you're doing a treadmill test, and this is typically how VO2 max is measured, you'll get on a treadmill, you'll continue to run faster and or at an increasing grade until you can't go anymore. You'll have a mask on. This is a very crude, description of a VO2 max test, but you'll have a mask on. It'll be measuring your oxygen consumption and your maximal rate of oxygen consumption. At the end of that test is what is known as your VO2 max. So the ability to consume or to utilize rather more oxygen, it's a significant predictor and it's related to endurance performance. So marathon runners, Tour de France cyclists, cross-country skiers, people like that will typically have incredibly high VO2 maxes. So it's a well-recognized marker for endurance performance, but for health, people should also be concerned about their VO2 max. Recently, there's been a lot of data correlating VO2 max to longevity, so a lower rate or lower risk for all-cause mortality, cardiovascular disease mortality. So the higher your VO2 max, the longer you'll live, and the lower your risk will be for various diseases, notably like cardiovascular disease. And the fun thing is that, it's not just something that athletes need to be concerned about. Just regular people, non-athletes or non-professional athletes can focus on increasing their VO2 max, and increasing it by just say like 1 unit will have incredible benefits for kind of health and longevity. So There's also kind of this argument though that people will say VO2 max is all genetic, and they'll sort of use that to discount why VO2 max like isn't important, or why these studies are kind of flawed. So, well, people with higher VO2 max are just, they already have that naturally. Well, to some degree that's true, but what that essentially means is that your ceiling is limited by genetics. So somebody who has a 90 VO2 max was sort of destined to have that, whereas someone else might have a VO2 max ceiling of 60. But if their VO2 max is only at 40, that means they still have 20, a score of 20 to improve, 20 points to kind of improve on that VO2 max. And training can do that. So I think endurance training is the main way to do that. You really aren't going to get a VO2 max improvement with strength training, or probably even with something lower intensity like walking, unless you're incredibly inactive or somewhat unfit. So engaging in endurance exercise multiple times per week, 2 to 3 times per week, probably minimum, is going to be essential for improving VO2 max as well. So I would say, the importance of endurance training: 1, for the cardiovascular aging; 2, for VO2 max; and 3, I think that kind of the unrecognized benefit or underappreciated benefit of endurance training would be related to cognitive function. There have been some pretty interesting longitudinal studies that I've read lately too, just showing higher physical activity levels, which mostly include kind of aerobic, moderate to vigorous aerobic activity, are correlated with like lower brain aging. They can help prevent dementia, Alzheimer's disease. And again, I think that's due, 1, to the metabolic benefits that endurance training can have, but also those blood vessel effects that I noted earlier. A lot of cognitive decline, Alzheimer's disease, dementia, it occurs because we have blood vessels that go to our brain, just like we have blood vessels that go to all of the muscles in our body. And endothelial dysfunction in brain blood vessels, or say the carotid artery blood vessels leading to the brain, can also cause reduced brain blood flow and impair cognitive function. So exercise training improves the health of those blood vessels too, and I think that's one of the reasons why it's kind of associated with better brain health.